I want to talk about gender equality now.
Yeah.
In chapter 11, you write about the so-called oppression of the patriarchy. And you
Yes.
write, it looks to me like the so-called oppression of the patriarchy was instead an imperfect collective attempt by men and women stretching over millennia to free each other from privation, disease, and drudgery. So the oppression of women happened because it was practical?
No, the oppression of men and women happened because life is difficult and treacherous. And so we were subject, and still are, to all sorts of terrible burdens that are intrinsic to life itself. I mean, one of the things that's happened is because we're so technically and materially wealthy right now, we don't understand what privations our ancestors, even a few generations ago, faced. I mean, it was very difficult for women to function, let's say, as technical equals in the absence of reliable control of menstruation. That's only been a reality for, say, 70 years, and the birth control pill as well is a major technological revolution.
You mentioned technological advancement,
yes.
So the hurdles have been removed in part way, but you talk about the so-called oppression of the patriarchy. But
yes.
Women were oppressed for centuries. I mean,
well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that men and women were oppressed for centuries. I mean, there are certain burdens that women bore that men didn't bear, but the opposite is equally true. Yeah, men suffered dreadfully, for example, in incredibly dangerous occupations.
But it's a fact that women suffered more than men.
I don't believe that, no, and I don't think it is a fact. I think that most people suffered by modern standards immeasurably, and that I don't buy the historical narrative that the fundamental reality of our history was that men were oppressing women. First of all, women aren't that easy to oppress, as you might have noticed if you've ever had a relationship with them. And you might say, well, it took women a long time to struggle forward until they attained civil rights status that was equivalent to men, and I would say that's true, but it also was the case for men that it took a very long time to struggle forward before there was anything approximating individual rights, and that they were granted to women quite rapidly in the aftermath of that. And that a lot of that was a consequence of technological transformation that made that sort of thing even possible.
But we are both privileged white males. Can we really understand the suffering of women?
Well, it depends on how useful your capacity for understanding the suffering of others is, or how well developed that is. I don't see that it's necessarily any more difficult to understand the suffering of women. Well, I would never pose the question that way, because I don't know how you understand the suffering of a group being an individual. I don't think a woman can understand the suffering of women, because that's predicated on the assumption that an individual can take on the burden of a group, and I don't buy that assumption to begin with. I think we vary in the ability to, let's say, empathize with others, but I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that you can't empathize across a gender barrier, otherwise no relationship would even be possible.
But a lot of people argue that cultural oppression is still a fact in modern society. For example, something feminine is considered insulting. Doesn't that sustain the oppression of women?
Well, I think that there are negative stereotypes associated with both forms of gendered behavior, and that if those are utilized inappropriately, they can result in prejudicial attitudes. I think that most enterprises are imperfect enough so that some residual prejudice remains. It might be sex, it might be preference by gender, or prejudice by gender, it might be prejudice by race, it might be prejudice by ethnicity, or attractiveness, or intelligence, or character. There's all sorts of things that warp the proper selectivity of hierarchies, but I think we're doing an unbelievably good job at getting rid of those as rapidly as is humanly possible, and that we've moved so fast in that direction so quickly that we deserve some credit for it.
There's one line in the book where you say you don't agree with the theory of the feminist revolution of the 20th century, but isn't that the fact that the feminist movement of the 20th century had a significant impact for gender equality?
No, I don't really think so.
What about Simone de Beauvoir? What about equal pay? What about what happened in the 60s?
I think that to attribute that primarily to the feminist political movement is to give far more credit to the feminist political movement than it deserves. And I think the people who are pushing that are primarily feminists. I think that most of what freed women was the extension of the idea of individual rights to everyone, including women, and that was happening not only on the front of women, let's say, but also with regards to people of different races and ethnicities. I think it's part of a much broader cultural movement to extend the idea of individual rights universally. I think that's deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I think that a very large number of technological innovations played a far more important role in the emancipation of women than feminist political ideology, even though you can point to certain movements, like the suffragette movement, for example, that pushed hard to have the vote extended to women. But even that, I would say, was a manifestation of deeper transformations at a cultural and technological level. I think the people who are pushing the idea that it was feminist political machinations that produced the equalization of the situation between men and women are mostly die-hard ideological feminists who like to think that way, but it doesn't look to me like that's a valid historical interpretation in the least.
I would like to move on.